Hey there, and welcome to this video on the history of surgical stapling. You know, through history, there have been several materials used to perform an anastomosis, that is, the joining of hollow structures in the human body. Some of them, for centuries, have been sutures and staples and compression anastomosis. Today, we're going to focus mostly on the history of stapling. So when we talk about staples, let's think about this type of staples and this type of stapler. You know, a normal stapler contains a cartridge that holds the staples, a pushing element, a driver, and an anvil, which will form the staple like a letter B. Now, imagine the difference between this, which we use every day, and these. These are surgical staplers to be used in human surgery. There are 4 types of surgical staplers in use today. 3 are internal and 1 is superficial or for skin. The internal ones are 1. The linear cutter, 2. The linear stapler, and 3. The circular stapler or end-to-end anastomosis surgical stapler. The 4th group are the skin staplers, and skin staplers come in different shapes and size, but basically all they do is close a superficial wound. Now, there are several clinical considerations for tissue management and a good anastomosis. These are, in no particular order: 1. To minimize tissue trauma, to provide good blood supply, to create an adequate lumen, to prevent tension on the anastomosis, to allow adequate tissue margin, and last, to ensure leak-proof or watertight anastomoses. Before we start on the history of surgical stapling, we need to look at those surgical pioneers who set the stage for the rules of proper anastomosis. The first of these surgeons is Christian Albert Theodor Billroth. Billroth was the first surgeon to perform an esophagogastric anastomosis, and by doing so, he established the basic concepts for this anastomosis. Another one is William Stewart Halsted. Dr. Halsted not only established rules such as use minimum gauge sutures, reduce the tension between the edges of the anastomosis. Dr. Halsted, following Lister's principles, started the use of rubber gloves in surgery and started following the principles of antisepsis. In 1910, Dr. Halsted developed a sutureless anastomotic device which never went beyond the prototype stage. And speaking of sutureless, Dr. John Benjamin Murphy developed a compression anastomotic device or ring that became known throughout the world as the Murphy button. And this device is the precursor of all the compression anastomotic devices in use today. But that's another story. Let's go back to stapling. The first one to actually invent and construct a surgical staple was a Hungarian surgeon, Dr. Humer Huttl. He developed this surgical stapler, and it was something like this. Well, not exactly like this. It was a linear stapler, but it weighed 15 pounds. And it was very difficult to use. But Huttl had several ideas that are used in the staplers of today. The 2 main concepts from Huttl's stapler that we use today are: 1, a double staggered staple row. This is important because it allows 2 things: the proper holding of the tissues, closing of the tissues, and second, allows for proper blood supply to the cut edges of the anastomosis. The second one is the B-shaped staple, And this is important because it allows for control of the height of the staple and therefore controlled tissue compression. You know, an interesting historical side note is that Humor Huddle's stapler was so heavy, so cumbersome, so difficult to use. The concept was good, but the instrument was difficult to use. He only sold 60. It was not until 1921 when Dr. Aladar von Petz, another Hungarian surgeon, invented a new stapler following Huddle's concept, but it was so much easier to use. It sold by the thousands. It used silver staplers, and this was truly the beginning of the era of surgical stapling. Still, Aladar von Petz's surgical stapler had to be loaded one silver staple at a time. That was time consuming. It was not until 1934 that Dr. Friedrich in Germany invented the interchangeable cartridge. After that, not much happened until in 1950, Russia, well, then it was called the USSR, created the Scientific Research Institute for Experimental Apparatus and Instruments. That's a big name. But what they did was create an incredible number of different staplers, specific for bronchus, for cornea, for arteries, for veins, and in between all of those, there were the linear staplers, the linear cutters, and the end-to-end anastomotic devices that we use today. In 1958, an American surgeon, Dr. Mark Mitchell Ravitch, traveled to the USSR to attend a meeting on blood transfusion. For one reason or another, the first meeting could not happen, and Dr. Ravitch was invited to observe surgery. He was amazed to see how Russian surgeons removed lungs using bronchial staplers. Dr. Ravitch tried to obtain an instrument, and he was told you couldn't do it. That evening, at a cafe with a group of friends, he learned that he could actually buy one instrument, and that instrument was the first stapler that was brought to the United States. Back home, Dr. Ravitch and his assistant, Dr. Felician Steichen, started doing research and development on a new stapler. You see, the Russian stapler was handmade, and the parts were not interchangeable between staplers. Dr. Ravitch and Dr. Steichen developed the instrument and approached American manufacturers, and they were rejected. In their book, Current Practice of Surgical Stapling, Dr. Ravitch and Steichen say, interestingly enough, a number of American manufacturers, knowing of our interest, visit our laboratories and operating rooms to see how the staples perform, but for one reason or another decided there was no future in stapling, to their later expressed regret. Eventually, American manufacturers started developing these products. In the 1960s, these products were reusable. In the 1970s, disposable surgical staplers started to appear. Disposability ensures functionality and guarantees sterility. In 1990, laparoscopic surgery appears with laparoscopic cholecystectomy, and new instruments are now needed that can enter through a small port instead of large incisions. These instruments, some of which you can see here, are specifically designed for this. So what's in the future, which by the way is right now? Instruments are being developed that can be used with robotic surgery, minimally invasive robotic surgery, NOTES surgery, natural orifice transluminal endoscopic surgery, instrument that can be used through an endoscope. The future is bright for surgical staplers. But now, let me show you how these three types of staplers are used: linear cutter, linear stapler, and end-to-end anastomotic device. So here we have a linear stapler. A linear stapler has a single double staggered row of staples. and it will close off an organ. The way to use it is that you place it, secure it, close, and fire. Once the instrument is fired, the surgeon will take a knife or a pair of scissors, cut the organ, whatever is going to be removed, and then open the device, and you can clearly see a double staggered line of staples closing off. Here you see some staples that were not included in the organ, and you see they're V-shaped. This is a linear cutter. A linear cutter consists of two halves, an anvil half and a cartridge half, and you can see it is made up of two double staggered rows of staples plus a cut line for a knife. The instrument is placed on the organ that needs to be transected. We align it, close, fire, open, and you see immediately a perfect transection of the organ, with each side with a line of staples. This is an end-to-end anastomotic stapler, also known as a circular stapler. What this instrument does, it allows to perform end-to-end anastomosis of two hollow organs like this. In this case, we have already cut a segment with linear cutters, and now we'll perform the anastomosis of these two ends. We will now prepare the instrument and come back to show you how it's done. The anvil has been placed on one end and already passed. Now we're going to drive the cartridge half on this side, and then these two ends will be brought together like this. The instrument is now being closed, and the two ends are now ready to be anastomosed. So you see now both halves are being joined in a circular manner, and I don't know if you can see this, but if you look down the tube, you can see the anastomosis perfectly formed. Thanks for watching this video on the history of surgical stapling and staplers. My personal thanks to Covidian for providing the instruments, and if you want to learn more about human anatomy and surgery, be sure to follow Medical Terminology Daily every day. Thanks.